Hello, friends, and welcome back to another NBA Insider video live stream notebook right here on the one and only Bleacher Report app. My name is Jake Fischer, your resident NBA Insider for all things Bleacher Report, and this has not been a quiet week in the NBA. So much going on, so many news and notes items to touch on here as we are coming to you live Thursday, December 4th, 5 p.m. Eastern, just over 10 days away from the official start of NBA trade season, December 15th, when the majority of players who sign new contracts this summer as free agents become eligible to be moved. And there could be no bigger player to change teams this season, literally and figuratively, than one Giannis Antetokounmpo, which is a dynamic that the league has been monitoring ever since this summer. Really, I remember being at the draft combine in Chicago and watching Giannis's agent, Alex Saratzis, mill around the complex at the Marriott Marquis in the arena, the Wintrust Arena across the Sky Bridge, taking meeting and approacher after approacher around the halls of that, league convention where at the time there was very much this noise like there had been in 2020, like there had been several other times of Giannis teasing. He said it himself when he came back and joined the Bucks at media day, quote unquote, temptation of wanting to explore what his career could look like outside of the only franchise he's ever known. It seemed like the understanding in Milwaukee was that after this quote unquote exclusive negotiating window that occurred between Milwaukee and New York before this season began, that he was committed to this season and committed to the Bucks for the entirety of the 2025-2026 campaign. And when things got started and everyone was healthy, I saw the vision a bit. Miles Turner was someone that the Bucks and that front office always identified as the ideal replacement if they ever were going to lose Brook Lopez, as they did do on the open market when Lopez went to the Clippers this summer. And Kyle Kuzma has absolutely shown massive major strides on the defensive side of the ball, which has always been his biggest demerit as a player, aside from the fact that, he's putting the ball up more times than not when he has a touch, but he's now out there guarding Jalen Brunson in full court situations. And Milwaukee, I thought, was really shaping into a legitimate playoff team before Giannis first went down with an injury and the Bucks lost game after game. They are now out of the play-in picture right now. And Giannis, of course, last night strained his calf that you see right here on the chyron below, which is a scary injury with the history that we have seen in the league and just anatomically with the calf connecting to the Achilles tendon. That's something that you don't want to mess with. So that is a monkey wrench in the timeline here, 2 to 4 week window, which that puts us on the earlier side of that, right after December 15th, the beginning of trade season. So that's going to loom over the dynamic here, but Giannis is going to loom over the entire trade market. And until we get a definitive answer that the Bucks are not moving him and that Giannis is not going to be on the block, we've talked about this in past weeks about how, you can't really trade for Domantas Sabonis without really knowing what Anthony Davis's trade status is. Usually that happens position by position, where you don't want to move forward on a player without knowing who could else be available at that position. Giannis is just positionless, a multi-time MVP, a defensive player of the year candidate year after year, and someone who still has a year plus left on his contract with a player option after that. And just a total opportunity for a team to completely thrust themselves into the championship conversation if they aren't already, by adding a player of his magnitude. So he has not officially requested a trade. Doc Rivers, the head coach of the Bucks, said that pregame last night. And that's kind of been Milwaukee's company line all along, where they're in lockstep with Giannis and they're always having conversations with him. I just ran a story this past week on Monday with Chris Middleton, the longtime former sidekick for Giannis in Milwaukee, where he said it candidly on the record that he knows Giannis has to do what Giannis has to do, and Giannis put a lot of pressure on this Bucks front office. And that ultimately resulted in trading Drew Holiday for Damian Lillard and trading Chris Middleton for Kyle Kuzma and so on and so forth. So until they actually get a legitimate trade request, I don't think the Bucks are going to move on from him. But there is absolutely a prevailing sentiment around the league right now that Giannis is going to inevitably get there because the Bucks are just not that good. So to the chat where DeMalte Brando wants to know any chance the Knicks are a trade landing spot. I mean, that was ostensibly where Giannis wanted to go if he was going to go anywhere this past summer. So they have to be at least a factor in the conversation. However, I think that what this is really going to come down to, what any team and what any real likelihood of Giannis getting moved to your team, your favorite team, if you're going to be asking in the chat, it's going to come down to what does Milwaukee really want? And I think that's what the Bucks are going to spend time on exploring over the next couple of weeks too. Are they going to prioritize just value of picks? Are they going to prioritize young blue chip prospects? Are they going to want someone back in return who can keep them in the playoff picture? That is going to be the end all be all of where this thing ends up. And so to bring this back to New York, if the Bucks do want to remain competitive and get back established talent, the Knicks have Karl-Anthony Towns, OG Anunoby, Mikal Bridges, like multiple of those guys are going to have to be out the door from a salary matching standpoint regardless. And so is that enough to entice Milwaukee? It wasn't this summer, but that would be, I think, the way that a New York situation occurs if Milwaukee wants ready-made established talent in return to continue to be a playoff team. But it's too early to tell right now exactly where the Bucks want to go. Easy Dirty Bird said, how is his injury? I talked to one person today who has some type of knowledge about Giannis' status, who said that he does not anticipate the injury to be so severe. So that's a good thing for everyone involved. JC9 says the Lakers better not overpay. Well, the Lakers really can't. The Lakers don't have anything comparable to a draft pick war chest that a San Antonio could put out, an Atlanta could put out, Utah could put out hypothetically. Memphis, even with the return they got for Desmond Bane, just again, speaking hypothetically here, the Lakers just don't have that. And they have an easy situation that you could just match LeBron's salary, but what does that really do for Milwaukee? Getting a 41-year-old who wouldn't want to be there. So I don't really know what the Lakers situation. Someone actually, I just texted about it earlier, just texted me back. And like the real thought about the Lakers is, does that mean Austin Reeves going out the door? And any team trading for Austin Reeves would have to risk losing him to unrestricted free agency this summer. He is going to be one of the most sought after free agents on the marketplace. And does Austin Reeves want to be in Milwaukee? Does Milwaukee look at Austin Reeves as their guy to build around moving forward? Like, that's the kind of questions I think you have to ask with all these situations if you want to figure out the answer. Ernesto, how about the Spurs? Are they willing to stop the build for a win now? The Spurs back during the draft were not willing to entertain that when they had the number 2 pick. The Bucks weren't really willing to entertain it, but everyone I talked to said San Antonio did not want to move the number 2 pick that became Dylan Harper for Giannis, for Jaylen Brown. Remember that rumor is going around. So I don't think that has changed. Last thing here from Crystal, if he gets traded, where do I think he goes? I really don't know yet, but right now, I think a team that makes so much sense for everyone involved would be Miami. They've got a hometown kid in Tyler Hero. They've got Khalil Ware. They've got Jaime Jaquez. They've got draft picks. The Heat have been withholding their full offer that they could have put for Damian Lillard, that they could have put for Kevin Durant this past summer. knowing that someone such as Giannis could reach the market. I don't know if they will. Again, it's super early, but that to me is a super interesting outcome that could happen. And we'll touch on more of this definitely next week in our notebook, definitely in more notes to come on my joint Substack effort with Mark Stein at the Stein line. But for now, that's our initial Giannis breakdown. And we got to keep things moving to Los Angeles, where the Clippers, in the dead of night, announced that Chris Paul was sent home from this ongoing East Coast road trip when the team moved from Miami to Atlanta. And they are moving on from one of the greatest players in franchise history after just what I was told from various sources with knowledge of the situation was just a difficult thing behind the scenes where Chris was part of this rotation when the team started the year 3-2, and then the losses started to pile and he fell out of the rotation. And this has generally been a overall worst case scenario in the total range of possible outcomes for this Clippers roster, where they are the oldest team in the league. They are one of the more expensive teams in the league, and they have only won 6 games, and right now would be sending the Oklahoma City Thunder a top lottery pick in June's loaded draft class. Bradley Beal's already out for the year. We reported last week that the Clippers submitted paperwork to the league for a designated player exception. I don't think that's going to really be a factor here with Chris Paul's departure, because the Clippers are 1.2 million right around short of the first apron, and they cannot exceed that. So they're a little bit hamstrung about what they can do to replace Chris Paul and figure out how to move forward here. The cleanest way would be to trade him to another team for another minimum salary contract and just 1-for-1 flip him. And I'm not reporting this is a conversation that I've heard, but something just conceptually, you flip him for Kyle Lowry in Philadelphia, where Lowry's a similarly aged on the way out. It's probably his last year of his career, if not one of the last, making a $3.6 million veteran minimum salary. Something like that would be the cleanest situation for the Clippers to just contractually, CBA-wise, move on from Chris Paul. But Lawrence Frank has said this in a Zoom press conference. They put this out in their written statement that they want to work with Chris Paul and his representation to move forward and do right by someone who is one of the most consequential players in franchise history. And there's no way that Chris Paul knows exactly what he wants to do right now. This just went down. He entered this year wanting to have a final year with this franchise that he's meant so much to, where his children live after spending so much time elsewhere. Maybe he does just want to stay home and be dad. Maybe he wants to try to compete for a championship. Maybe he wants to play somewhere where he gets the greatest opportunity for playing time. I think those are all things that he's going to have to sift through and consider with his close group, and bring that back to the Clippers and see what makes sense for all sides involved. Dub Deasy said CP3 needs to go back to OKC. He developed those young guys. I don't know what the likelihood is to bring in a potentially volatile personality to a Thunder group that is 21-1 and is literally miles ahead of every other team defensively right now, and just looking like they're steamrolling their way to an opportunity to defend their championship. I really would be surprised if the Thunder wanted to put in such a dynamic variable into their equation that is absolutely humming right now. Bree Will says, I want to know who leaves Miami for Giannis. Well, again, like I said, there's more to talk about there in the coming days and weeks, but I think the question really about a Miami scenario is, can the Heat get Milwaukee's attention and get enough out the door without putting Bam on a bio in an outgoing package? DJ Lopez says CP3 to the Lakers, finish with a ring with LeBron. I mean, that would be the easiest scenario in terms of staying in Los Angeles, right? You know, New York had interest in him. Minnesota had interest in him. Milwaukee had interest in him this past summer. All those teams in theory, would still have some interest. But again, I think it's going to come down to as much of what Chris Paul is looking for in conjunction with what likely scenarios exist on the board with what teams want to do as well, because the Clippers do want to do right by Chris Paul in this scenario, even though they also definitely wanted to get him away from this team. We have one more chat here before we're going to move on to our next subject. Is there any realistic chance trade rumors for Zach LaVine this season? Like, what are the Kings even doing? We're going to get to Sacramento at the bottom of this show in the new NBA trade buzz. But as I've said previously, as I've written previously, I think the most important aspect of Zach LaVine's trade candidacy this season is that LaVine has a player option for next season for the 2026-2027 campaign. And I've heard from so many teams now, so many rival front office executives, that they would be far more interested in acquiring Zach LaVine if they knew what his willingness and appetite was in order to tear up that player option that's going to pay him damn near $50 million next year and bring him in at a longer term, shorter salary figure situation. I don't know exactly what those numbers would look like that would make sense for both sides, but if you could get Zach LaVine to get rid of that $50 million and put that over a 2-year number, that's simple math right there, would be something that I think far more teams would be willing to do. Get him on a 2-year, $50 million agreement so he gets the same exact money that he would be theoretically turning down, or something more like a 3-year, 75, where it's that longer term deal, more money than what he was, but at a much lower rate. That type of situation will exponentially improve Zach LaVine's chances of getting traded in Sacramento's market for actually moving him at not a negative value. Zion Williamson probably has negative value right now himself. And the question on the ticker is Zion's season over? And we don't know that. We know he's going to be reevaluated in 3 weeks after a hip injury. But this comes after he missed already 8 games with a hamstring injury, and after he entered this year having played less games than he's sat throughout his entire career. So it's certainly a fair question to posit whether or not Zion is actually going to retake the floor this year, because this has been the same situation over and over and over again, and he has never proven an ability to consistently be on the floor. So with that in mind, you can rest assured that the Pelicans are going to be listening to trade offers for him. And there are definitely teams that believe, that have told me as recently as today, that New Orleans is now starting to listen and at least show some type of willingness to listen on guys like Herb Jones and Trey Murphy as well. And those guys are going to have a lot of interest around the league. They are both on very strong long-term contracts that are considered relatively team-friendly, under $30 million in average annual value, which is a big threshold in this current market. We saw that in the rookie scale extension situation this fall, where no one made north of $30 million. So to have those guys on team-controlled deals with numbers considered relatively modest, they're going to have a lot of interest, but the Pelicans are going to hold a high asking price. And they're going to need multiple first-round picks to move on from either of those guys. That's my understanding as of now. But right now, it is pretty clear that the Pelicans, with interim head coach James Borrego, are moving in a direction of a team built around Jeremiah Fears and Derek Queen. They're 2 lottery picks from this draft, and bookends of a lineup and a pick-and-roll duo that could potentially take this Pelicans team into their next iteration of the franchise. And that is both as much due to that coaching staff and that front office's belief in Fears and Derek Queen, to the point where they traded that pick to Atlanta this summer to jump up and take Derek Queen, but also because of Zion's inability to perform. As Keek wants to know, is it worth it to keep Zion going long-term or give the reins to the young talent? That is the exact question that New Orleans is contemplating. And I think a lot of their answer is going to be dependent upon how easy it is to part ways with Zion. The other thing is his contract is very, very individual and unique compared to most max salary contract players, where he has games played minimums and body fat percentage requirements that could potentially turn his deal into non-guaranteed money. So depending on how all this goes, Zion, definitely there are levers in play for the Pelicans to potentially even part ways with him on their own and simply waive him if he doesn't trigger the necessary requirements to fully guarantee that contract moving forward. So I think it's interesting that both him and John Morant, after being the number one and number two picks in their respective draft in 2019, were anointed as these next exciting up and coming franchise face guys, potential future face of the league guys, and both due to health as much as anything else have been unable to really make good on those situations. And both of them right now on the trade market would not fetch anything close to what they would have at the relative peak of their careers. So I think for those two guys, Ja and Zion, for Trae Young, for any potential sweepstakes that could come with LaMelo Ball in Charlotte, it's all going to be dependent upon what type of actual value and trade package those teams could get back. Because right now, I saw someone in the chat, I forget who, asked like who would realistically be trading for Zion. It's going to be difficult to find a team that would trade for him with any real outgoing value, unsure of what his actual availability is going to be just to take the floor, let alone how much he costs, let alone draft capital, all that stuff. So the Pelicans are going to factor in here in this trade market as a potential seller. And I think that's where we're going to close today's show with new NBA trade buzz, because no matter what, no matter who's available, no matter who's looking to buy, I think it's easiest to figure out and start piecing together the puzzle pieces of the NBA trade marketplace by identifying who's going to be a seller. And it's difficult right now to do that because there are so many teams who want to be good. The Pelicans did not expect to be bad this season. They definitely had hopes of competing for a playoff spot. Really entering this year, every single team in the Western Conference outside of the Utah Jazz thought they were going to be good this year. Even Sacramento had some type of thought that they were going to be competing for a playoff spot. Now, that's not the case for the Kings. That's not the case for the Pelicans. That's not the case for the Clippers. That's not the case for the Mavericks. All of those teams, except Los Angeles, I think, are absolutely positioned to be sellers right now. In Dallas, of course, the biggest name that you're going to talk about and hear about is Anthony Davis. But we've been writing on the Stein line. Mark Stein, the Dallas legend, has been writing for some time now that Daniel Gafford seems to be the most likely trade candidate of all the veterans in Dallas. I think that's for several reasons. Number one, they just have a long-term center of the future in Derek Lively. And Gafford is on a pretty relative $18 million average annual value contract that I think teams would trade for and would have some value around the league compared to the difficulty of matching an Anthony Davis massive salary right now, and knowing that Anthony Davis is going to be looking for a contract extension of his own that's going to be paying him roughly $70 million moving forward. That's going to be an absolute difficult factor in forecasting any Anthony Davis trade scenario. The Clippers, I don't think, outside of the Chris Paul stuff we talked about earlier, I don't think they're in sell mode right now. As terrible as their season has gone, they are still just 5 games out of the 8 seed. And James Harden and Kawhi Leonard, when healthy, have been playing some of the best ball of their career. So I still think there's some hope internally there that over time, that parting ways with Chris Paul, that bringing in Ray J. Dennis on a 2-way deal that we reported last night could start to turn the tide here little by little and take things one day at a time. So I'm not looking at the Clippers as being a seller right now. But the Pelicans, the Kings, the Mavericks, I'd say Portland, even though they did want to win, they do have some veterans to move in Robert Williams and Jeremy Grant that I think they'll be more willing to than before to listen to incoming trade calls. Brooklyn's got veterans to move from Cam Thomas to Michael Porter Jr. to Haywood Highsmith, who will be returning at some point in the near future, and we'll see what he could show to rival teams. He's on a very modest, under $6 million salary that could plug and play in several places. I think the Pacers have some selling to do, potentially with Benedict Mathurin. Charlotte, that's going to be the key in figuring out what potential movement we could see, because there are plenty of teams who want to buy. Jason Lakers wants to know, for example, without breaking up their core, how did the Wolves get a starting elite point guard? Like, the Wolves have definitely put out signals that they're looking for guards, right? They've called on John Morant. So Jason Lakers is asking, what about Trae Young? I mean, that's the exact type of dynamic, distressed asset point guard that I think the Wolves are poking around on. To answer the question, I think it's difficult. I mean, they just can't get to that salary without putting one of Julius Randle, Rudy Gobert, or Naz Reid on the table. And the Wolves have just not wanted to part ways with any of those guys to this point in time. They're definitely not trading Jaden McDaniels. So you need to put at least one of Rudy Gobert, Julius Randle, and Naz Reid out the door. And at that point, it's not just a salary matching standpoint. You're going to have to, it takes two teams to make a trade. So which of those guys would the other team want more of? But from a Minnesota standpoint, a big reason why the Wolves targeted Julius Randle in that Karl-Anthony Towns trade, in addition to Dante DiVincenzo, was that the Wolves valued Julius Randle's on-ball creation ability to help supplement Anthony Edwards' duties on ball and to free him up to do some more off-ball scoring, some more attack and closeout situations when the ball swings. So theoretically, Julius Randle's ability to do all that would become a bit redundant if you added a major point guard next to Anthony Edwards. So it's curious to me to see how all that could break. C. Gray says CP3 to Detroit could make sense. I definitely could see that, having a secondary guy next to Cade Cunningham. But does Chris Paul want to go all the way to Detroit away from his family in Los Angeles? That's something that we're just going to have to wait to find out and see. Cameron J15 says, could the Wolves target DeJounte Murray? He absolutely was someone Minnesota looked at before trading for Rudy Gobert. There was definitely a conversation between the San Antonio Spurs and the Minnesota Timberwolves before the Timberwolves went out and made the big Rudy Gobert trade, before DeJounte Murray was traded to Atlanta. They were looking at DeJounte, so they did have interest in him in the past. I just don't know what their interest would be now after he's had, a season-ending injury that he's recovering from right now. The chat in general is talking Timberwolves. Definitely a lot of Timberwolves buzz. That is for certain, but that's because the Wolves are good, and that's because they might not be good enough. They've made a couple Western Conference Finals runs. They haven't gotten over the hump. They are right there in the thick of the top of the West right now, but point guard play is certainly a little bit of a question mark with them as Mike Conley gets older. And Tim Connolly, the president of basketball operations there, has just proven a penchant for getting involved in trade conversations. He did this back when he was running Denver, trying to poke around at maybe getting Paul George back when he was leaving Indiana. There was that whole 3-team thing with Cleveland and Kevin Love and all that. They got involved in the Kevin Durant trade sweepstakes and at the trade deadline this past summer. So they're going to poke, they're going to call when these guys become available. And we are going to call and try to get as much information from around the NBA to bring to you guys on our next iteration of our Video Insider live stream notebook next week, and the week after that, and the week after that, every week as we march closer and closer to the February 5th trade deadline. So for now, we appreciate you guys tuning in. We appreciate the chat, and we'd appreciate it if you tuned in next week for our next NBA Insider video live stream notebook right here on the Bleacher Report app and on YouTube as well. Thank you guys. See ya.